Remember when British politics was straightforward, even a bit dull? The UK's new Foreign Secretary does, because he was Prime Minister back then. As David Cameron returns to frontline politics, what will it mean for the UK's relationship with the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. David Cameron's legacy from his time as Prime Minister was the Brexit vote that took the UK out of the EU. What else does his time in office tell us about what he'll bring to his new role as the country's top diplomat?
This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
The 2016 referendum called by David Cameron, his legacy and his undoing.
I expect to go to the palace and offer my resignation.
How are you going to reach out to the Red Wall, sir?
His return as Foreign Secretary, announced early last week, sent shockwaves through political circles. The current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, decided to change key cabinet members following inflammatory remarks by the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Most notably, she said homelessness was a lifestyle choice and wrote an opinion piece criticizing police for their leniency towards pro-Palestinian protesters, who she dubbed hate marchers.
With Braverman out and Cameron in, the cabinet has undeniably moved toward the centre. While the far right in the Conservative Party aren't happy, Rishi Sunak will hope that bringing in a heavy hitter like David Cameron will give the Prime Minister some much-needed political clout.
I hope that 6 years as Prime Minister, 11 years leading the Conservative Party gives me some useful experience and contacts and relationships and knowledge.
He has met a number of leaders who are still in power and may still have good relationships with some of them. Looking at the most pressing issue in his in-tray, the war in Gaza, his position on the subject appears to be somewhat vague. Following the October 7th Hamas attack, Cameron tweeted, "I stand in complete solidarity with Israel," and backed the UK's support of the Israelis. But he has been critical of Israel in the past. During a House of Commons speech in 2010, he called Gaza a giant open-air prison. And a month later, in a resurfaced clip, he said the situation had to change.
Humanitarian goods and people must flow in both directions. Gaza cannot and must not be allowed to remain a prison camp.
During a 2014 state visit to Israel, he revealed that his great-great-grandfather was a Jewish man from Germany, and he told the Knesset, "We are with you," in Hebrew. Meanwhile, Cameron has criticized Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Despite some mixed messaging, what is clear is that the world has changed significantly during his 7 years away from the spotlight. Will it be the old David Cameron or a new one who tackles the challenges of 2023 and beyond?
Well, let's meet our guests in London. John McTernan, former political secretary to Prime Minister Tony Blair and now a political strategist for BCW, which is a global comms agency. And joining me in the studio, Norman Baker, former Liberal Democrat Home Office Minister. Norman served under David Cameron's coalition government from 2010 to 2015, and Gina Miller, the leader of Vote True and Fair Party. Gina, I'll come to you. You're on record this week as describing the reshuffle as moving the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yes, it's a desperate move from a Prime Minister who's run out of road, really, and doesn't have a vision or any plan. Because normally, if you look back at Cameron, who once said that he wasn't a believer in reshuffles, that's because he had a vision, he had a plan, and the cabinet knew where they were going. Whereas Sunak has no idea where he's going. So these are desperate moves. And what's really intriguing, I think, about the Cameron, Lord Cameron now appointment and Esther McVey is that he seems to be facing two ways. So one is to appease the Red Wall with Esther McVey and giving her a soapbox. I actually think rather than a Minister of Common Sense, he should have called her Minister for GB News, but that's by the by. And then Lord Cameron, who is, looking to appeal to the more centrist Blue Wall. So, they're a divided party and he's trying to face two ways and possibly the worst decision he's made for a long time.
Norman, you know David Cameron well. You've worked with him in government. How do you think he will have felt sitting in a cabinet meeting for the very first time not being Prime Minister?
Well, look, David Cameron is what was called a liberal conservative, and his instincts were far more towards a Lib Dems, if you like, in coalition than you'd find in any of the Conservative ministers these days. I mean, he was hug-a-hoodie. He was snuggling up to pandas.
Call me Dave.
All these sorts of things. And you can't imagine really Cyril Braverman or anyone feel like that doing that. So, I mean, not so much hug a hoodie as be expel a hoodie in her case. So, I mean, he's a fish out of water in the present cabinet, which has gone so far to the right, it's unrecognisable from the party he led in 2016. He is a chairman rather than chief executive, if you want a pen sketch. He didn't really do detail. He left that to George Osborne in many cases. He was pretty affable individually, but he was also rather petulant on occasions. He bore grudges, particularly against me, because back in about 2008, I reported him to the House of Commons for using his parliamentary office to raise funds for the Conservative Party. He had to apologise to the House for that. Never quite forgave me.
John, the panel seemed to think that this for Sunak was desperate times calling for desperate measures.
Yeah, look, I think the question I have is, who is Rishi Sunak? Who's the real Rishi? So in the summer after Uxbridge, the by-election, he was anti-net zero. Then in September, he was relaunched as the technocrat, the man who had spreadsheets, who could solve any problem. Then at conference he was turning his back on the failed consensus of 30 years, of which 20% of them were David Cameron as Prime Minister. Then he's a tech bro, sitting at the feet, kneeling at the feet of Elon Musk, looking up adoringly. And now he's, bring back David Cameron, turn towards the blue wall, but also bring back Esther McVeigh and have a war on woke. So who is he? This is the real essential leadership question people want to know. Most people don't focus on what a Prime Minister does from day to day. They get a sense of who they are, therefore, which direction they're going, what decisions will they make, what kind of things will they make. And I think you get, I'm not sure about what Rishi Sunak really is. On top of that, I have to say, I think David Cameron's a really strange appointment as Foreign Secretary. His foreign policy record is Brexit disaster, Syria disaster, Libya such a disaster it left ungoverned territory, which is the home of people smugglers. And he's come back to government without resolving the issues around Greensill, lobbying, all the questions around that. So he'll be dogged by questions from the British press about how much did you get from Lex Greensill? How much did you make in Colombo? What have you been doing over the past few months? Things you can brush away as a private citizen, former politician. They come back to bite you a lot when you're actually having to front up ministerial press conferences. So I think Rishi's done something that made him feel smart for a day, but it's going to dog him for a time. And he's actually got issues of substance. He's not tackled the cost of living. Inflation's fallen through no actions of his, but the cost of living is still too high for most people.
Gina, some great points there. First of all, who is Rishi Sunak?
I think it's to my first point, which is he wanted to be leader, but he didn't ever have a plan. And that's a problem. You know, he was so beguiled by the leadership. But, it is very worrying to have a prime minister with no plan and no direction of travel, who literally could be swayed by whoever is shouting loudest in their party, or whichever arm of their party is shouting loudest. And we've got this for another year or whatever, however long it is until the election. But we have serious problems in our country. The cost of living crisis, AI, the conference showed that, the summit showed that we've got real issues coming down the track. And instead of using a British Prime Minister only has 109 places for a minister, to actually use 2 in such a reckless way shows that he really is not a leader. And unfortunately, I think he's going to be the leader who takes the Conservative Party into the election, because I don't think they can have a leadership challenge now. But he will take them into the wilderness for a decade or more.
Norman, do you agree?
There's one common factor between the two of them, actually, between Sunak and Cameron, which is a failure to take on the extremists in their party. And we advised Cameron back in 2010 as Lib Dems, look, you've got a majority here in Parliament, in the government, which is pro-Europe, as you are, David Cameron. Why don't you take on these nutcases on the far right of the Tory party, as Tony Blair took on Clause 4, if you like, back in those days, and get rid of them. And if 1 or 2 want to resign, let them go, and then the rest will fade away. And Cameron tried all the way down the line to compromise with these people, and Rishi Sunak's doing the same thing. He's trying to appease the right wing of the Tory party at the same time as holding on to the seats in the South. You cannot do that, and it's a sign of weakness. He needs to take on these people who are clearly wrong and actually out of line with the Conservative tradition and say, this is where I stand. follow me or get out. He
I
doesn't
think
say
from a
that.
voter point of view, you've got somebody who's the architect of Brexit and all the damage that that's doing for our country, and the architect of austerity. So, his record domestically is blighted and has not been forgotten by voters. And as John rightly says, his international record is appalling. To have him as Foreign Secretary is alarming, actually.
So tell me, John makes a good point. Sunak has done this to feel good for a day.
Yeah.
Why has Cameron done it?
Well, Cameron's done it because he's bored. Because once you've been Prime Minister, with all the trappings of office and the world at your fingertips and what you do today affects this person and that person, and then suddenly you're out of office, you've lost a ministerial car, you've lost everything, apart from the police guard, of course, who was still with you. And what do? Went to a shepherd hut and wrote his memoirs. What happens after that? And the man has clearly feel he's got something. He's quite young, really, compared to some of the Americans, anyway, who are in office. And he clearly got something to offer, and that's why he's come back, I imagine.
John, I want to talk about one key policy that has been making headlines for weeks, really, in the United Kingdom. Rwanda. Where do you think that policy is now, off the back of the Supreme Court judgment the other day that it's completely illegal to do this?
So I just wanted to pick up from what Norman was saying. Malcolm Rifkind once was asked, what's it like not to be a foreign secretary anymore? And he said, you come out of your house, you sit in the back seat of your car, and it doesn't start. I thought that's a great description of what it's like to no longer have the accoutrements. Yeah. But look, on Rwanda, I think it was a devastating judgment by the Supreme Court, and everybody should read it. They wrote a really clear and detailed judgment, and it tells you in real detail that basically they do not believe the facts and the judgments of the Home Office and the government, and they do believe what the United Nations have been saying about Rwanda. And they've set some tests which are so profound that Lord Sumption, who used to be on the Supreme Court, compares the response by the government. Rishi Sunak said, we respect the rule of law. However, we're going to pass a law immediately, in a mercy law, to say that when the Supreme Court say Rwanda's not a safe country, we're going to pass a law saying it is a safe country. And Lord Sumption said very crisply, when something is black, you cannot pass a law to make it white. And I think this is the problem. The details of the judgment are so clear, and the situation is so clear, that Rwanda is not a fit place to send anybody. It never was, in my view, either morally or legally. We've now got absolute clarity on the legal status. And I think the danger for Rishi Sunak is that he's got himself trapped in a cul-de-sac. He's going to keep on acting on this, trying to legislate, failing to legislate. Either it fails in the House of Lords or it fails in front of the Supreme Court. And at the same time, what the public wants is the NHS fixed. What the public want is crime to come down. What the public want is Britain to be fixed, not a fantasy of trying to fix Rwanda or the image of Rwanda so it's okay to send people there. And I think one of the funniest of all of the defences that the Home Office put to the Supreme Court was they said, look, it doesn't really matter what it's like in Rwanda, because this will be such an effective deterrent. We'll in the end send nobody there. And what we have is to go back to the patient and difficult work of how do you find safe and legal routes for the genuine refugees, all of our staff, our translators from Afghanistan, who are waiting to come to the UK, having served the UK loyally during the war against the Taliban. All kinds of people who want to come to Britain because of a deep cultural, personal, familial connection to our country. We need to find safe and legal routes for them so they can become workers as soon as possible. In the focus that the government has on making everybody illegal, then detaining them, then making their life here terrible. 80% of people who apply for asylum status in Britain up until the new legislation got asylum status, refugee asylum status. So the government should be working on how to get those people active and working in our country, bringing new vigor and new energy. I think Rwanda is going to dog them, it's going to hang around their neck. If there's anything to repel the blue wall, it's being so harsh on genuine refugees, genuine asylum seekers.
Gina, one politician we haven't mentioned yet, Suella Braverman, she has driven this policy because she knows it's what people who vote for her want.
I mean, I'll just pick up one thing on the judgment. I mean, this is the third Supreme Court judgment against a government who's trying to put themselves above the law in 6 years. What does that say about this Tory government? I mean, it is extraordinary because the separation of the three estates is so important. It is there. The separation is there, you know, to ensure that there isn't tyranny and that citizens are protected. So it was fantastic to see the rule of law being protected. But then you've got MPs like Lee Anderson saying you should ignore the judgment, ignore the courts and get the planes flying straight away. I mean, it again showed to me Sunak's weakness that, you know, the whip wasn't withdrawn from Mr. Anderson because he's basically inciting people to go against a ruling and to go against a judgment and to go against the law. And that is so dangerous to do as a message to the country. And that aligns with what Suella's doing. At any cost, they want to appease the right of the party. But Suella is on a track to be the next leader.
Do you really think so?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the soul of the Conservative Party after the next general election is going to be fought over by the right of the party and those who deemed to be in the centre. But, you know, but she won't have a clear run because you've also got people like Kemi Badenoch and others who will go. But she is focused on a particular part of the Conservative Party and membership to get behind her so she becomes the leader in opposition.
Norman, do you think Sunak now has a problem that Suella Braverman is rattling around the backbenches and has started her leadership campaign?
He's got a problem. He won't take on these people who need to be taken on. That's the essential problem. He's given them so much rope to wander around and make statements which should have been nipped in the bud. I mean, when she made that statement about homelessness being a lifestyle choice, he should have dealt with her at that particular point. That's an appalling thing to say. It's also, by the way, a vote loser. I mean, maybe she's a bit like Trump. She's energising 15% of the population, but she's antagonising the other 85% who find it appalling what she's doing. And I know from the kind of Tory voters in my part of the world, then the South East, they don't like this sort of language. And they know, for example, that some of the people who are sleeping on the streets are ex-servicemen, for example, who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, have got post-traumatic stress
mental
disorder,
health problems.
Yes,
mental
exactly.
health problems, and they need help. They don't need to be categorised as lifestyle choices by the Home Secretary.
I mean, knocking on doorsteps, because I'm standing in Epsom and Ewell, which is normally a blue, you know, One Nation sort of blue seat. People are absolutely appalled by this government, by Suella, and they can't understand why Sunak didn't get rid of her earlier. You know, as you say, it's not. This has been a litany of politicising issues that are about humanity, and she has actually gone so far down the line that she, you know, it's having, as Esther McVeigh, so looking over wokery. Well, actually, it's Suella Braverman who's weaponising everything, and wokery, she's the one who's weaponising
But
everything.
I think she will become the Tory leader.
I think so.
If Nigel Farage doesn't, that is.
well, yes.
After the next election, she will be. And she'll be a very unpleasant section of the community. They'll lose quite heavily. But the opposition, the Tory opposition as it will be very nasty indeed.
John, you served under Tony Blair. How would he, if he had in a million years a politician like Braverman in his ranks, how would he have dealt with her?
Sacked immediately.
Yes.
Not appointed in the first place, but sacked immediately with that kind of behaviour. The issue in all crises in politics, you have to do quickly what you're going to be forced to do eventually. In the end, Sunak had to sack her. That was obvious. Everybody could see that last week. Exactly, it was exactly right. Norman said it. Exactly right. Those words about homelessness being a lifestyle issue, when we know how many former veterans, former soldiers, former members of our armed forces are sleeping rough. That was the moment she crossed the line. When she attacked the police, she crossed the line, and it should have been no surprise to any cabinet member. Once the Home Secretary attacks the police get attacked by thugs. But the point of leadership is you may make mistakes in your cabinet. They then make errors. You warn them, and then you act to look tough. And the problem with Rishi Sunak is he was weak when appointed as Prime Minister. He did a deal with Suella to become Prime Minister. He was weak, and you're only ever, you're the strongest ever as a politician the day you walk into number 10. So Tony would have acted out of strength and become stronger. What's happened is Sunak has acted out of weakness and become weaker.
I think her letter, actually, what she revealed in the letter about the deal that they'd made was very illuminating, because that just shows you how weak he is. And actually her doing that, I mean, the tone of the letter is somebody who is not going to just sit there in the back benches. She's going to be throwing grenades all the time.
Norman, let's look ahead to next year.
Just going to say on last comment on Suella, or on Sunak actually, up on his wall is his motto, I am their leader, I must follow them.
Let's look ahead to the British general election. When it happens at some point next year, they can go as far as January 25, but that's highly unlikely. Where does Sunak think he's going to claw back 20.2 percentage points? That's how far behind Labour he is.
In my view, it's too early. It depends on what the election campaigns are going to be. I mean, we saw in 2015 that it didn't, we thought Labour were going to win then, depending on the campaign. So it's about how they're going to run their campaign and what the errors are during that period of time, because people are not quite focused yet. But it is that campaign. And, we look back at what Gordon Brown did in 2020. Before that, he'd appointed Lord Mandelson. And then they were out of government because that didn't go down well. So it's too early to tell. But I think it's the campaigns. What is it that they're going to run on? And we don't know that yet.
I think it's quite clear from the by-elections. I mean, first of all, the Tories were in big trouble. And I think unless there's some miracle happens or some war or something, then they're out of office. Looking at the by-election results, I have to say, and you might say I would say this, wouldn't I? But the swings to the Lib Dems in the south
have been massive.
Have been better than the swings to Labour. No, the swings to Labour are quite impressive, but the swings to Lib Dems have been off the scale. And I think they're actually in more trouble with the Liberal Tories in the south than they are with the Red Wall in the north.
And
Gina, I think that's why they brought Cameron back, to appeal to them. That's why I think one of the moves.
So do you think we're into the last few months of Sunak and a Conservative government?
I think it will take a lot for them to actually hold on to power. If they were to go into coalition, I mean, what is also interesting in the polling is how well Reform UK are also polling.
Yeah, which is helpful to the Labour and Lib Dems, actually.
Yeah, which is very helpful because they'll split the vote. So the idea that that's being talked about, that they could go into coalition with the Conservative, I think is nonsense. They'll just split the vote. But I think the Conservative Party will be out of power for a good decade or more, but they will tack to the right. And as a country, that's very dangerous because we will have a divisiveness and coming from the opposition benches that will not lead to a cohesive community and country.
No.
John, what's your reading of where Britain is heading with elections next year then?
Yeah. Well, I have a secret fear that the elections won't be next year. They'll be in 2025. Because watching politicians, you know that once they start running from the voters, they never stop running. And it's like you try and identify a point next year when there's good news for Rishi Sunak. Well, would you hold a May election? Probably not, because things won't have turned round. Will you hold an October election? Well, in September, there'll be the waiting list on the NHS are predicted to go over 8 million. It's really hard to see what the right point for the Tories to hold an election is. And I kind of disagree with Gina, and I agree with Norman, actually. Something's going on in the voters. We've not just had one Black Wednesday, as John Major had in 1992, a kind of fundamental breach of trust between the Tories and their voters. We had the trust quartering budget, which was the Tories basically throwing away their ace card, economic competence, their reputation for great economic management. But that was on top of Boris Johnson partying while we had a lockdown. And that the emotional force of that has not gone. People felt betrayed. Nobody in Britain let each other down. The government, the Prime Minister, the Tory Prime Minister, the Tory government let them down. And I think that's what's in the polls. In one sense, big sense, the voters have decided that they're not going to listen to the Tories again, whatever they do. That's why whatever change Sunak makes, the gap is 15 to 20 points. And I think the fix is in. And what Norman pointed to is basically there's no need in our country for an electoral pact between Labour and the Lib Dems. Voters are doing a kind of making their own mind up. It's kind of.
I will say though on the doorstep. I was going to say on the doorstep though, John, don't underestimate the people saying I'm not going to vote. They're all the same, because that's also what we're hearing on the doorstep. So there is huge anger against the Tories, and people want them out for a variety of reasons. But
I fully agree with Gina with what you just said, because I think one of the things the Tories have as a strategy is, if we can't deliver, let's destroy the belief, the hope that anything can happen.
How damaging is that, Norman?
Well, it's very damaging.
Labour's got to rise to bring hope back.
It's damaging to the body politic, really, because we want people to engage in politics. We want the highest turnout possible. We want democracy to be functioning, and effective, and it's not if people stay at home. I think a lot of people who stay at home will be Tories, by the way, who are fed up with the Tory party but can't bring themselves to vote for somebody else. I think there's an element of that in there. John's right about, by the way, about the electoral pact. There's no need for that. And there wasn't before 97 either, actually, and I'm old enough to remember that back in political terms. In 97, people were just saying, how do we get rid of the Tories? Who's going to win this seat? Who can win this seat? Right, we'll vote for them. And it was as simple as that.
And tell me, Gina, how worrying is it then that you've got a large number of people in Britain who are sick of politics and possibly won't even vote?
Well, no, because they're angry. There's a divide. People are angry and know that it's time for change, and they just want the Tory government gone for a number of reasons. And actually, the COVID mismanagement, the horrendous insensitivity and corruption, and everything we saw was slightly waning, but the COVID inquiry has actually brought that back to people's minds. People now are exercised again about how dysfunctional it was. Actually, it's much worse than we ever thought it was. So the COVID inquiry has reminded people of how terrible the Tory government were and how they lied and how they were going to pile bodies up high. It was inhumane, all the things we've learned about that. It's criminal, actually. I think it's criminal. What happened at that period of time. Yeah. So that's reminded people of that. But there is still this feeling of they're all the same. We can't quite shake that. We still are picking that up on the doorstep.
John, Gina, Norman, thank you all. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.